How's it going, everyone? It is I, Anime Outlet, and this is What If Deku Had a Regeneration Quirk, the movie. And now, let's begin. Izuku would be born to the parents of Inko Midoriya and Hisashi Midoriya. However, that wasn't his parents' real name. They were the number 10 hero being Hisashi and the number 20 hero being Inko. They just wasn't their real names. They knew if they were going to go out in public, they needed fake names so that they wouldn't be recognized. They'd also have to have just disguises, different credit cards, and all these different types of things so people wouldn't recognize them on the street. And this especially came when they had a child with Zuko. So they needed to make sure nobody knew they had a child. And so they did this by having fake names. If no one knew they had a child, they couldn't have that used against them, say if a villain attack were to happen and they would capture Zuko. So Izuku would grow up quite the normal childhood for a kid. That was until he turned 4 years old. Izuku would jump out of his bed, banging on his parents' doors, yelling for them to wake up so they can go to the Quirk doctor's office so that he can find out what his cool quirk is going to be and so that he can become a hero. His parents would get up telling Izuku that the doctor office doesn't open for another hour, but it did take an hour to drive there, so they might as well go. So they would end up getting there an hour right as the doctor's office was open, as they would make an appointment for them to check what Izuku's quirk was, and since they were the only person there, they might as well just do it now. So they would be rushed into a quirk doctor's office as the doctor would then look down at Izuku, take a couple tests, and would take them to the lab. 30 minutes later, he would come back with some test results. He had to do everything rushed because they were on a tight schedule. And so if they needed to get these people in, get their quirk set, and then leave as soon as possible, so the person that made a set appointment at a set time could get in and do that instead of having to wait and leaving a bad review, which could tarnish the reputation of the office. So they would rush everything as the doctor would then come in with some bad news. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Midoriya and Mr. Midoriya. Your son here, Zuko, appears to be quirkless." Immediately, both the parents would say, "What do you mean? He can't be quirkless." They were expecting him to have a very powerful quirk. They were heroes, after all, and very high ranking heroes, too. So when they heard the fact that Izuku was quirkless, they couldn't believe it. It was insane. So immediately, Hisashi would grab Izuku's arm, yanking him up as Izuku would tell his father that hurt, but he wouldn't care, as he would tell Inko to get up as they would rush out of the office. The doctor looked sad by this, as he had saw this happen many, many times. It is something that happened so many times when he was being a doctor there. Every time he would tell a parent they had a quirkless child, something like this would happen, and he would never see that child back in their office again, for at least most cases, or if they did come back in the office, they would end up having bruise and signs of abuse, but he couldn't really do anything about that. He would just ask them if they fell or not, and they would say yes. He couldn't call the police because most of them had ties to the police and would just end up getting him fired, as he lived in quite a rich neighborhood, which these people had lots of influence, and if he were to say something otherwise, he would very easily either be killed or be thrown in jail. So he couldn't really do anything about it. So Izuku would be sitting in the car as he would look around completely scared. He had just been told he was quirkless, and both his parents were acting very strange. He couldn't figure out why they were acting like this. So Izuku would see them just driving the car in a completely opposite direction from where his house was, at least from the direction that he knew where his house was. So Izuku would be confused. He would see them enter a forest as he would look around, as he would finally look down out his window to see a very steep hill with a huge tree line at the bottom of it. So Izuku would then hear the car come to a stop. As he would look over to his window, as he would see his father already out of the car and yanking open his door, as he would grab Izuku's arm and would push him out, as then kicking his back down the hill, as Izuku would then come tumbling down the hill, crying out in pain, just reaching towards his mother and father, wanting them to help him, but they of course weren't. They had already gotten back in the car and had started to drive off. As Izuku would then hear a massive crunch. His back had hit the trunk of a tree, as he would then fall limp down at the base of that tree trunk, as Izuku couldn't even feel his legs, as he would reach out onto the hill, grabbing the side of it. He was in a massive amount of pain, but was trying his hardest not to scream at all, as he just had a feeling if he were to scream, he would probably end up dying. So he would end up climbing back up this hill slowly, and it hadn't rained in over 2 weeks. So the ground was extremely hard, as rocks were completely just stuck in it, and every time he would accidentally grab one, it would completely just tear off chunks of his skin. As Isuku would start to just climb up, as the dirt that was quite soft, even though it wasn't, there were still tiny patches of it where it was a tad bit soft, as it would start to get under his fingernails, as Izuku would continue to climb up until he reached the road. As he would just sit there, he would just pass out. He had used all his energy to get up the hill, and he had nowhere else to go. And he laid there. Multiple cars would pass, and finally, when it was pitch black, a car would then roll up and would see him there, as a woman would step out of the vehicle and would pick Izuku up. "Oh, you poor thing," the woman would say, putting Izuku into the van, as they would then drive off into just some strange building. It was an orphanage, as Izuku would then be sat in a bed in their medical unit, as Izuku would then be just kept in health, or at least tried to become back into good health. Izuku, by the time he woke up, his legs just could be used again. It was strange to have completely no feeling in his legs, but now there was feeling. It was quite strange. Izuku would end up looking up at the person that was standing next to him, looking down at him, as she would finally speak. "Oh, you're awake. Now, child, can you please tell me your name so I can hopefully try to find your parents?" "Oh, my name is Izuku Midoriya," Izuku would say, as the just caretaker of Izuku would shake her head, nodding it, saying, "Okay, I'll be back in a minute," as she would then leave the room and would walk into a massive room with a computer, as she would type in Izuku's name and would see that he was missing, along with both of his parents. So the lady would then look to where his quirk was listed, but would then frown. He was quirkless. She would immediately walk back into the room, glaring at Izuku, grabbing Izuku by the arm, as she would then yank Izuku and would walk Izuku over to a very dark door, as she would then push Izuku down these stairs into the basement of the orphanage. Immediately, Izuku could tell it was very moist there, as there was water running into a drain quite close to him, as Izuku could hear it. While he was asleep in a sort of coma, it had rained very hard, and the basement was sort of flooded by that, as Izuku would then look on and all around the walls, as he would see mold everywhere. It clearly was not kept in good health. And now let me give you guys some context. This world is a lot different from canon My Hero Academia. Quirkless people are looked down upon. It is insane how much they're just nobody cares about them. If you're quirkless, you are seen as trash, completely garbage in the eyes of society. And so since there is 20% of the population that is quirkless, 20% of the population is usually abused, and which leads to them end up dying at a very young age. So Izuku would end up looking around to see tons of other kids like him in this basement. You would see them just cowering in a corner as they would look on to see another one who would come. As Izuku would then look down and would sit there completely confused. As many weeks would pass, kids would come and go, and there was never a kid older than 6. As once they would make it into there, they would all end up dying before they turned 6. They might last to the age of 5, but they never would last to 6. And no kid would come in there at the age of 6 or 7. All of their parents would have ended up killing them by then or throwing them in some random orphanage just to be mistreated by some random caretaker. So Izuku would be sitting there just distraught. He would see his friends would end up coming in. He would make friends with them, but they would then end up dying all around him. However, he would still end up surviving. It was quite strange. Why was he the only one surviving while all the other kids were dying around him? Why is that the case? Izuku couldn't explain it at all. So Izuku would just be left to sit there in his own thoughts as he would stop making friends with them. He didn't want to lose them like he had lost the friends before him and his mother and father. So he started to push away his friends that he already had, as he would end up losing the friends he didn't want to lose. It was just a lose lose situation, as Izuku would then last there until the age of 9, when he would end up hear the door opening as someone would walk down there. As Izuku just thought it was a mealtime, as he was expecting the just leftovers of all of the kids upstairs who had not finished their meals to just be thrown down there in the disgusting water. However, that wasn't the case. He would just be yanked out of where he was sitting as they would end up walking up the creaky stairs, as Izuku would look down on all of the other Corkless kids as he would see how they were treated like animals, how he was treated like no better than some pig found on a farm, just being thrown this slop food that has no nutritional value to them, which would make them have stunted growth. Izuku, however, didn't have this. He had a quirk which no one knew about. He was the oddball out from everyone else that was in that basement. As Izuku would finally then be yanked up, as this woman would then speak to him. You somehow lasted until you're 9, which doesn't appear to happen. So I guess you deserve to be up here for a little bit, but don't get used to it. Izuku would look around, seeing furniture. There was no furniture down there, and he hadn't seen it since he was 4. He was completely astonished. Everything looked so much crazier from what the basement was for the last 5 years of his life. As Izuku would then walk around seeing kids playing, but when they saw him, they would run away. Izuku looked like a complete monster to the other kids who were kept clean and tidy, while Izuku was left down there to rot with the other Quirkless kids. So Izuku would then just look like a demon to everyone else, as they would start calling him names like a demon, hoping that would push him away from them, and so he wouldn't go near them. As Izuku would just be walking around. When dinner time finally came, he would sit on the ground, not having a chair to sit at. Some kids, feeling sympathy for him, would try to feed him, but he would never accept this, as he would learn that people that did feed him, and when he was caught with food like this, people who were caught feeding him would end up being punished, as they would end up going into a room much like the basement, but they would never come out of it. Izuku would watch the doors wanting for someone who felt sympathy for him to come out of that room, but they never would. Of course, they would end up coming out of that room, but in just not what was their body. They came out of the room in a trash bag, as Izuku didn't know this. He was confused why they never came out of that room, and he would finally end up learning that as he was caught doing something that was against the rules he was never told about, as he would be taken into that room. Izuku would be shoved into this room by the orphanage owner, as he would then see a chair in the direct center of this room. He would be forced down into this chair as straps would go around his legs and arms, as he would just be forced to sit there. As this nurse, which is the orphanage owner, I'm going to be calling them the nurse from now on, as the nurse would then end up leaving the room, as it would then be around 30 minutes before they would then return, as they would walk in and would then flip a light switch, revealing many sharp weapons on the wall, as this nurse would then grab one and would walk over to Izuku, as she would then raise up her arm and would chop down, as Izuku's arm would then fall down to the floor, as she would then do it for the other arm and then for both of his legs, as she would take these and would walk over to a cutting board, peeling all of the skin and meat off of the bones, as she would then start to prepare it and make it meat. She would just start to dice Izuku's arm into tiny cubes, as she would peel back the skin from Izuku's muscles and meat, as Izuku could hear the cracking of his skin peeling off of this just muscle that was his arm, as Izuku would be forced to listen there as he was in immense pain. He had just completely passed out from how much pain it was, but he woke up just seconds later, wishing he would have stayed just completely unconscious, as it was true torture. As Izuku would be left listening to this, and just around an hour later, this person would put all of just the meat and everything she had chopped off of Izuku into this bag, as she would then lift it over her shoulder and would walk out, as Izuku would then realize it was he was eating the kids that were in there. Why else would she prepare Izuku's arms and legs like that, unless she was about to prepare it for a meal or for a stew? And Izuku saw the stew, as the meat in there was cooked in the exact same shapes as she had cut them, as Izuku had realized he was eating the people that had tried to help him, as he would just be left there to his thoughts. As the next morning would finally come, as the nurse would walk in, about to discard Izuku's body, just letting him bleed out and die, so that this quirkless kid would know his place and not have a quick and painless death. As Izuku, however, was still alive and had all of his limbs, even though she had cut all of them off just around 12 hours before this. The nurse would look on in shock at Izuku, just wondering how the hell he had all of his limbs. She had just cut all of them off, and now they had suddenly regrown. This is insane. And why? How did this happen? Now, I'm about to explain why the nurse is acting like this. And sure, this, if it was the normal My Hero Academia universe, they would just think, oh, it's a quirk. However, that is not the case. This is a different universe from that. A universe where it is extremely rare to have a regeneration quirk. So rare, in fact, that only a select few people know that there is such things as a regeneration quirk, and that 1 in 100 million people are born with a regeneration quirk, meaning if there are 7 billion people on Earth, only 70 people will have a regeneration quirk. Which one of those would be Izuku, who was very lucky and had gotten it. This would also explain why the doctor didn't identify that Izuku had a quirk. Sure, Izuku had power, but it didn't seem like a quirk. It was some random regeneration thing, but this couldn't be brought up by the computer. There was no quirk that was close to it, and so he just couldn't tell if this was a power, a quirk, or what it was. This means that most of these 70 people that have a regeneration quirk would end up having misidentified quirks or just be labeled as quirkless, even though they had an extremely rare and powerful quirk on their hands. So, what would this nurse, who is extremely religious, see Izuku as? She would see Izuku as a demon, a sort of offspring of the devil, as she had learned from the people before her that quirkless people were just spawns of the devil, and in order to get rid of them, they had to kill them. However, they couldn't kill them themselves, as that would be a sin in their eyes. So they would send them down to the basement, and that is where they would think that God would just do all this magical work and would end up killing them, even though it was the horrible conditions and diseases and illnesses that lingered down in the disgusting, moldy basement. So Izuku, who had lived through that, was seen as some sort of protector of these children, the sort of bodyguard for the offsprings of Satan, as Izuku would basically be seen as a demon that was here to kill them and release these demon children out into the wild to kill all of humanity. These are the extreme views that these nurses of this orphanage had, and that is how they were taught, being raised in the orphanage. So, when they decided to stay back and learn the ways, they would learn how to be religious, why they were religious, and how bad quirkless people were, and why they must be exterminated. And so, seeing Izuku regrow his limbs, she was completely just in shock. Izuku would stand up out of the chair, his restraints being off. Now, the reason for this is when they were to cut his limbs off, they would have to remove the restraints. I mean, what was someone with no limbs going to do about that? They couldn't just get up and walk away. However, Izuku could, now that his limbs had regrown. He just decided to sit in the chair, waiting for his vengeance, as he would finally get up and would walk towards the nurse that was standing in fear and shock. I can see you have found out about my power. Such a thing cannot go to the world's mind. So I'll have to kill you for this knowledge you've obtained, Izuku would say, walking towards her as she would start to stumble backwards, falling into the rack of sharp objects that were lying behind her, as one would fall from above her, going right through her chest, as she would just start coughing up blood, as Izuku would walk towards her, smiling down at her, and would just start to laugh. I could give you a quick and painful death, but that's something I cannot do as of now. So I'll just let you sit here and rot, as Izuku would take out the blade that was in her chest, swiftly pulling it up, and would bring it right down in one swift motion, as Izuku would cut through both of her arms, and then her legs, as they would come clean off, as Izuku would then pick all of them up and would dump them right on top of herself to look at what she had become, as she would just be left rolling on the ground in complete pain and agony, as Izuku would be left watching her. Izuku had completely broken, not only from being in a dark basement for pretty much his whole life, as he couldn't remember much of it before he was 4, and then being tortured in a chair and having all this pain brought onto him just because he was labeled as quirkless, and he was now going into the full idea that he was a demon, something that this school children in the orphanage would call him, something even the nurses would call him, and so he would finally become what they had called him. Sure, he wasn't a real demon, as those didn't exist. He was a demon in his own imagination, however, as he would then kick open the door, as he would be the first person to return from that room that was not a nurse still alive, as Izuku would slam the door shut and would start to walk over to the basement door, which had a lock on it, as Izuku would then bring the blade that he had kept down onto the lock, smashing it wide open, as Izuku, opening the door, would release the children that were down in the basement, hoping that maybe they can continue on living if the diseases had not caught up to them. A few were too weak to move up the stairs, and Izuku knew even if he were to help them, they would surely die in just a few weeks, so he didn't bother. As Izuku would then march out of the orphanage, as he would start to look for something to do. This orphanage was in the middle of nowhere, as Izuku basically would have to walk for miles until he would reach another house, and that's exactly what he did. And when he reached that house, he would knock on the door, and when it opened, he would then put his blade through the stomach of the person who opened the door, kicking them through the doorway as Izuku would then walk in, as he would see the husband of the woman now laying on the floor would get up and would try to run at Izuku, having flames on his fist, having a flame fist type quirk. However, Izuku would merely dodge this punch, grabbing it with his bare hand, as scalding hot fire would then start to burn his hand. Thinking that this person had just lost their minds, the husband would smile, thinking they've won, and that this insane person was now done for. However, that wasn't the case, as Izuku would raise his other hand, which had the blade in it, which this person had neglected to notice, as Izuku would bring it down, as the head of his second victim would then fall to the floor, as Izuku would then march out of the house, much like the orphanage, but he would walk around it, looking for a shovel, and he found one, as he would then start to dig a grave where he would then dump the bodies there, as Izuku would then walk into the house, shutting the door, as this was now his house, and he was going to live here until he had decided to do something else with his life. And so he would just sit down and wait for something his mind brought up for him to do, as he would then get up and would look over into the fridge. His entire mentality had just been corrupted by what he had gone through for the past 5 or 6 years of his life. Remember, he is only 9 or 10 years old, and now he's basically just living on his own. The orphanage is without a head nurse, and the other nurses will have noticed the dead body, knowing they will not get paid anymore. They would have just walked up and left. So Izuku would just be sitting there wondering now what should he do, as he would then get an idea. He should devote his life to training and helping quirkless people so that they don't have to go through what he has done. But that was only a mere idea, and that was something an angel could do. Remember, he views himself as a demon, and that is something that would be too foolish for someone like him to do. It had already been a week since Izuku had escaped the orphanage, and he had already ate all of the food that was in the fridge and pantry at the house that he decided to steal and take from the family that lived in it. So Izuku decided to wander into town. Of course, he had no clue where the nearby town was, so he just picked a direction and decided to go there. Izuku was on a back road, so it wasn't like a paved road that was very easy to walk on. It was more like gravel and just a bunch of rocks just sticking on top of grass and dirt, so Izuku, who didn't have any shoes, was forced to walk in the grass, and it had rained just a day prior, so his feet were getting all muddy. So when Izuku finally made it to a road, he just thanked God that he could finally walk on something that wasn't just muddy grass, as it was getting very annoying to him, to the point where he actually thanked God that he could stop walking on stupid mud. And this was something Izuku would grow to hate since he didn't have any shoes. So Izuku would end up finding a town after around 45 minutes of walking. That should just tell you how far away a city was to Izuku's new house. So when he finally found the city, it just became time to find a store and to not get taken to a police station or something. What are they going to think when they see a 10-year-old kid with a sword, no shoes on, and ragged clothes, and his feet are all muddy? They're going to think, who is this kid? Is he some type of villain? And he's just a kid. Why does he have a sword? So when Izuku would walk into the store that he finally found, they wouldn't think much of it. He's just a kid after all. So when Izuku would go up to the store clerk and would point his sword at the clerk, telling the store clerk to give him all the money in the register, the clerk would just burst out laughing. So Izuku would take things into his own hands, as he would slowly walk behind the counter and would then point the sword right at the clerk, who would then put his finger on the tip of the sword and push it back to Izuku, which would anger him, as he would pull back the sword and would slice it cleanly through the torso of the clerk, as half of its body would fall down, as its legs would remain standing up until they would end up falling down to their knees. As Izuku would then look around to see the horrified looks on everyone's faces as they would see what Izuku had done, as Izuku would then open up the register, taking the money, as he would then grab a basket and would go shopping, as he would end up grabbing one of those non-recyclable bags or a reusable bag. So he would just start throwing random crap in there, like apples, cucumbers, random vegetables. He'd grab bread, peanut butter, all this random type of stuff that could last him quite a while. And by now someone had called the police, and so a police car would roll up to the store along with another police car, as they would both get out, as they would then point their weapons at Izuku, yelling for him to get down, but he wouldn't, as Izuku would walk towards the police officers, as they couldn't shoot a kid. He was a kid. Why would they shoot him? It's just taking somebody's life. Who are they to take someone's life? These aren't cops who have killed somebody before, and so they hesitated to take the shot, which caused Izuku, who had already taken lives before, to easily take care of them, as Izuku would then continue on his day, as he would then walk out of the city with people trying to avoid him. They heard on the local news that there was some type of kid on the loose, and it's best to just let the heroes take care of it, and if you see him, try to avoid him at all costs. So Izuku would have a very much enjoyable day going to back to his house from the store to his house, as he had gotten plenty of food and money, so now he could possibly buy some things that he just couldn't have with the house that he was living in currently. So when he finally made it back to the house, he would open up the mailbox to see that he had many bills to pay, and since he didn't have a credit card, he just decided to start rummaging through all of the people's items. He had cleared out the bedroom that he chose and also the bathroom so that there was nothing random in there, and he had just thrown it in a bunch of random closets and storage areas. So Izuku would decide to rummage through those and would end up finding just a bunch of jewelry and all sorts of stuff like credit cards, gift cards, anything that Izuku could find, he would end up using towards his advantage. So he would write down the credit card number on the bills he had to pay, would put them back in the mailbox, and would just send them off. He's a kid. He doesn't really know how bills work, and neither do I. So that's just how they work in this universe. So Izuku would just be sitting there wondering what he should do now, as he would then just go to sleep. The next day, he would put all of the jewelry he found in a bag and would then start to walk back to the city. As he would make it there, as he would start looking for a pawn shop. Once he made it to the pawn shop, he would then dump all the jewelry out onto just the clerks, just stand there, and he would ask Izuku what he wanted to do with all this jewelry, and aren't you a kid? You shouldn't be in this pawn shop. Which Izuku just said, well, I have all this stuff left over from my mom, who died recently, and I don't have I don't have enough money to buy myself shoes, and I'm wondering if I could sell these to buy shoes. Which the clerk would give him sympathy and would sell or would buy the jewelry from Izuku, who would then take the money and would walk over to the conveniently placed shoe store right across the street, as he would then pick out a pair of shoes that he could afford and would then buy them, putting them on his feet, as he would now be happy he didn't have to just walk around in just all this mud and everything. It had rained quite a lot recently. So Izuku would then go around looking for clothes and socks. He had a couple hundred extra dollars left, and he decided that he needs something to maintain his living, as he can't just go around living like a homeless person the rest of his life. He needs clothes to survive, as it's not like he is just going to stay on with his phony signatures on like bills. So Izuku needed warm clothing for the upcoming winter, as Izuku would buy all these things and would then just go back to the house. Remember, some people knew who he was, while some people didn't. Some people heard the myths and mysteries about this strange, mysterious kid who would wander in town with muddy feet, as they would see him walking around without parents with a sword tied to his back. And Zuku would continue on his day, getting weird glances and glares from random people, as shopkeepers would shut their doors and lock them, making sure Izuku wouldn't get in. They heard about the shopkeeper who was killed by a mysterious boy, and they didn't want to become just like that person. So Izuku would continue on his day, as he would continue doing these things, robbing stores and all of that, for 5 years until he was 15 years old, as Izuku would finally just be old enough to where he could start doing things that he knew he didn't want to. He could start to be a little bit more just reckless with how he went on about things. Sure, he just went into stores and robbed them without any face coverings or whatever, but he is now 15 years old, and he's not very much a kid anymore, as he's now turning into a teenager, and he's not going to be looked at a kid, so police aren't going to hesitate and give him sympathy like that anymore, as he knew he had to start being a little bit more serious about things he was going to do, as if he wasn't, the heroes would surely catch him and would then throw him in jail, possibly for life, because of all the crimes that he had committed in those 5 years to sustain his living. So Izuku would then go out into town. He needed food, however, this wasn't like any normal day, as Izuku would continue walking as he would see school buses passing by, as the school year had started just a couple of months before this, as Izuku would then look around, wondering where everyone was. Izuku didn't have a TV, and that is the very reason he didn't know what was happening. What was happening was the police and heroes had had enough of what Izuku was doing in the local town. So they decided to tell everyone through the local news not to go out today, as Izuku would be the only one coming, as they would make sure everyone knew it was lockdown, no one should come out, and only heroes and police will be outside as they are looking for Izuku, as over those 5 years they had searched the entire city for nobody for Izuku, and nothing came up. So they decided he's probably not close enough to be on the local news channel, even if he had a TV. So they decided do that, and when Izuku was walking down the road, he would end up looking at all the shops closed, wondering why they were closed. As Izuku would then finally realize that something wasn't right, as finally All Might would jump down right behind Izuku, grabbing Izuku by the shoulders, as Izuku would then start to struggle. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Izuku would say, as All Might just wouldn't care, as he would then put handcuffs on Izuku and would put him into the back of a cop car that was right by, as Izuku would then be transported to UA, where he would be blindfolded and would then be put in an interrogation room, as Izuku would be looking around completely calm and unfazed. He had gone into a police station before, and he thought this was another police station. He had easily escaped it once, and he could easily escape a police station again. He already had experience, so it shouldn't take as much time as it did before. So Izuku would start to struggle to get the blindfold off. However, it would then be ripped off by a tiny white bear, as it would then sit down on the table in front of Izuku and would ask Izuku a couple of questions. So, young boy, what's your name? Izuku would tell the rat-looking thing that his name was Izuku and that he hasn't had a last name. So the rat would just nod and would start to think. You seem young enough where we can twist your opinion on the world. How about you join UA? I'm sure you would make a great hero. You seem to last 5 years on your own, saying that you don't have any parents. So why don't you join us here at UA? And I could also get you out of the life sentence that you were to have definitely gotten in the trial that you would have gotten in just about 3 weeks. So if you join UA, I can get all of your crimes just taken care of, gone. Simple as that. Izuku would look at this rat and would then sigh, agreeing with him as the rat would take Izuku's handcuffs off as Izuku would reach out his hand towards the rat. We got to see All Might typing in Izuku's name into a computer, and only one Izuku popped up. He had been missing for 11 years, and he was labeled as quirkless, so they obviously didn't need to worry about cord-canceling handcuffs, and since they didn't put him in any at all. But All Might would then look back to the interrogation room to see Izuku's hand around Nezu's neck. Since Nezu had taken the handcuffs off Izuku, when Izuku reached out, looking like he was giving Nezu a handshake, he jumped at the opportunity as soon as Nezu put his hand out as well, grabbing his hands around Nezu's neck as Nezu would start to choke. However, Nezu would plead for Izuku to let him go, which Izuku would do, as Nezu had locked himself in the interrogation room with him and Izuku there to ward off from any interference from All Might or any other police that happened to be there. So Nezu would then put his hand out once again as Izuku would then shake it, agreeing to go to UA. Right after Izuku and Nezu shook hands, an alarm would sound as Nezu would look worriedly up at it, as the speakers would then turn on and would start to play a pre-recorded message. The UA campus is under attack, and this is not a drill. I repeat, the UA campus is under attack, and this is not a drill. As Nezu would then look through the window at All Might, as a police officer would barge through the door, and would then barge through the door into the interrogation room. This was one of the security guards on campus, who wasn't the best skilled as a hero, but could very easily be a security guard for the UA campus. As the security guard would then bust in and would say, "The USJ, sir, it's under attack." As Nezu would look over at All Might, as All Might would nod, as All Might would then jump over to Nezu, grab him, and would then start running to the nearest window, which was right outside of the room. So Izuku would follow them, as he would see All Might just jump out of the window and would start hopping towards the USJ. Not wanting to be left out, Izuku would follow them, thinking, well, if I'm a student, I might as well just follow them and see what they're doing, because they must be going to the classroom or something. Izuku wasn't that smart because he hadn't been in school, but he was a strategizer and he could very easily strategize things in a battle. He's not book smart, but he's just smart because of random and luck. That's pretty much it. So Izuku would end up following them, jumping out of the window and landing in a bush, as he would then start to run after the All Might silhouette that he saw barely just running into the distance as Izuku would run that way. Conveniently, however, it was just a long straight road on the UA campus connecting all of the classrooms, dorms, and just all of the cities and testing sites that the UA school uses. So Izuku would just very easily be able to follow where they were going. As he would then see them stop. Thinking he was close, he would speed up as he would see Nezu and All Might right outside of the USJ building, about to open the doors. As Nezu would look around, as he would see Izuku sprinting towards them, as Izuku would start sprinting up the stairs, skipping one stair at a time. Remember, he didn't want to be left out. As he would then make it up there, as Nezu would then yell at him, "What the hell do you think you're doing here?" Zuko would then just smile at Nezu, saying, "Well, I could have escaped, so you should just be happy that I'm still here." Nezu would nod, just agreeing with Izuku's statement, as All Might would then open the door to see complete chaos. Aizawa was getting his face smashed in by the Nomu, and 13 was on the ground looking like they were dead, as he would see a bunch of students fighting villains and just being knocked out or what looked to be dead, as All Might would then jump down towards the Nomu, as he would then grab Aizawa and all of the students and 13 who was knocked out, handing them to Izuku and Nezu, as he would tell them to move the bodies out of the USJ so that they couldn't get hurt, which they would do, as Izuku would then run back into the building, which Nezu did not want Izuku to do, as Izuku would see All Might struggling with the Nomu. Now, since this universe, the regeneration quirk is very, very rare and valuable, and so All for One couldn't get his hands on a regeneration quirk. And the regeneration quirk also has a very lucky genetic ability to not be able to be stored, transferred, or passed on to. So it can't be passed on through genetics either. You just have to get a miracle in the quirk draw and somehow end up getting a quirk. So Izuku was just that lucky. And since this couldn't happen, All for One was able to give another strength quirk to the Nomu, making it a lot harder for All Might to beat the Nomu. It had a regeneration quirk and a pain resistance quirk in the anime, while now it has a pain resistance quirk and two very, very strong strength quirks. So it could very easily overpower All Might, as it would very easily, as it would just continue to rapidly punch All Might's stomach in its weak spot. Sure, it didn't know that its stomach was its weak spot. It was just very easy to hit, as All Might didn't guard it as well as he should have, thinking it was just going to be another one-punch knockout like most of his other fights were. So All Might would go in with this mentality. However, it wasn't the case. He would very easily get knocked out by the Nomu, as the students seeing this would think they were all going to die. This is All Might we're talking about, the number one hero who was just gone. He's looking like he's completely unconscious. He's going to get killed by this Nomu and the villains, and then they're going to go after them because they're UA students. They're the future heroes. So if they eliminate the future heroes, there's not going to be any other heroes that are going to defeat the villains the next generation. It's a very simple and easy way to get rid of the heroes that are going to stop them in the future. However, Izuku was there, as he would immediately jump into action with his sword in hand, would stab the Nomu right through its chest. Sure, the Nomu had a pain resistance quirk, but that wouldn't help against Izuku very easily slicing through it. His skin was not very rough or hard to pierce. It was something very easy and smooth that could very easily tear, like a plastic bag. So Izuku was very easily able to do this. And the reason his skin was because this way is because that was one of the drawbacks of having one of his quirks. The pain resistance quirk made it so you had very easily just terrible skin. So if someone walked up to it with nails, they could very easily just take a chunk of the skin off, which wouldn't very do well against either a bullet or a sword. So Izuku would have a very easy time slicing right through its stomach. However, the Nomu seeing this would turn around and would punch Izuku across the face, sending him flying into a fountain, smashing into it as Izuku would hit one of the pipes inside of it, as the bricks and concrete would fall down onto him, along with the water running down throughout his entire body and all of the rubble. As Izuku would then get through the bricks, as his neck would then start to crack back into place. The Nomu's punch was so hard it completely destroyed Izuku's neck to where it was basically just unrecognizable. There was bones sticking out of his skin. However, Izuku has had so much practice with regeneration that something like this was not a very major injury to him. Hell, it wasn't even an injury to him at all. It would very easily heal itself, as Izuku would then look back at the Nomu and would fly at it. However, Shigaraki was watching this fight closely. This kid somehow looked like he was going to beat the Nomu who beat All Might, and this was just completely strange to Shigaraki. He also saw how Izuku's neck looked to heal itself, and this was surely something he would give back to All for One, hoping that All for One could possibly share intel on what his quirk might be and if it is worth stealing in the future. Remember, it can't be stolen. So Izuku would jump back into the fight with the Nomu, running with his sword in hand. As he would get to the Nomu, dodging under one of its fists, as it would then slice up, taking out the Nomu's left arm, as Izuku would then jump back, only to be met to a punch in the gut. The Nomu immediately jumped around and threw an uppercut at Izuku, which happened to hit his stomach area. So Izuku would then be thrown flying 100 meters back, as Izuku would look up at the Nomu, as Izuku would just flinch in pain. Remember, Izuku doesn't have a pain resistance quirk, it's only a regeneration quirk. He doesn't feel any of the pain of it healing, but he does feel the pain of it breaking and snapping. He just had enough practice to have a good pain tolerance. Sure, this isn't a quirk, so it's only down to a human scale level. So if his arm is just completely gone, it's going to feel like hell for him. Sure, he's already had something like that happen to him, so it's not going to feel as bad, but it's still going to feel like crap to him. So Izuku would jump back into it, not wanting to be punched again, hoping that he could just take this Nomu out once and for all. So Izuku would go for the arm, or the other arm that was left, hoping that the Nomu would just accept defeat after this. However, that wasn't the case. This Nomu is a mindless being who had one role: to kill All Might and then to kill all the students. That is just the command Shigaraki had given to him, and so he must act out that command. So he would run charging right at Izuku. However, Izuku would dodge under this, much like he had slid under to cut the Nomu's arm off. However, Izuku's sword would then go missing out of his hand. It would end up in the hands of the Nomu, who would then shatter the blade in its hand, as Izuku would look on completely shocked and then confused. He had had that blade for over 5 years, and it was now laying on the ground, and he had nothing to destroy this Nomu with. He was completely confused on what he should do next. Izuku, now realizing what had happened, would immediately jump into a blind rage. This was the sword and blade that he had gotten to show his triumph over the orphanage, to show that he finally conquered what he had not been able to do for 5 years, and now it was just gone, just completely destroyed. So Izuku, jumping into this blind rage, would run at blinding speeds right at the Nomu, grabbing a brick and tossing it right at this Nomu, as it would then stick itself right into the Nomu's brain, as the Nomu would fall backwards, completely void of life. It had died from Izuku's brick throw, as Izuku would then look on at the Nomu just in a complete glare. His blade was now destroyed, as he would look over at the blade and picking up the shards of it and would just crumble it into his hands. How could this blade be so weak, and yet he used it for so long? As Izuku would then fall out of this rage, and would then just sit down on the ruins of the water fountain that he had destroyed from the punch he got from the Nomu, as Izuku would then just sit there to think about his thoughts. Moments later, police cars and ambulances would then arrive, going into the just building, taking all of the villains out, getting any of the students who were hurt just in an ambulance to go to Recovery Girl's office, as they would just do this very, very quickly, as crime scene investigators would come there, and crime scene cleaners would come there and start to clean up the mess, as Izuku would then get up and would start to follow Nezu back to the UA building, as Nezu would start to walk back there, which would be quite a while before he even got back to the building. And by the time he got back, it was dark, and Izuku not really having a place to go because he knew they weren't going to let him go back to his house that was a 2 hour walk from there. UA was in a whole other city, as Izuku's city was, so it would have taken him around 2 to 3 hours to even get back to where he lived. We cut back to Nezu and Izuku walking, as Izuku would then sigh and say, "So, what now?" Nezu would just think, just wondering what he should do now. UA had gotten attacked for the first time by villains in its entire history, so he was completely confused on what he should do. So Nezu would then just smile at Asuku and would say, "Well, hopefully none of the villains go out and attack the students' homes or parents. So to avoid that, I'll decide to build dorms, which I'll get Cementos, I don't know what the name is or how to pronounce it. I'll get him to build dorm rooms. And since I also know you don't have a place to stay, you could live there too, since I'll be putting you in Class 1A. That's also because you gained my trust with what you did to save All Might and the rest of the students there back at the USJ. So just feel lucky you somehow have gained my trust. Not a lot of people can say that, especially somebody who's killed many people in acts of villainy." It had been a day since the USJ incident, and Izuku and Nezu were now sitting in Nezu's office. "So what now?" Izuku would say. Nezu would then tell Izuku how he is going to have to recap on all of the things he had missed in just about the span of a month. So Izuku is quite lucky. He just has to cram 2 months worth of information into 1 month, as he's going to be training with Aizawa while the rest of the students are away, since Nezu decided to give the entirety of UA a month off to prepare for the sports festival and to also cover up the USJ incident, while also making dorm facilities and more practice facilities for the people who go to UA, as he thought it would be much safer. He would also try to upgrade the security system, even though it was already one of the best security systems in all of the world. The only thing they didn't know what to beat it, or what had beaten it, was Kurogiri's Quirk. It was the one thing that the USJ system and the UA security system couldn't match. It's because a quirk like that is so rare, and for it to have fallen into villain hands is just a shame. So Izuku would be sitting in Nezu's office waiting for Aizawa to show up, as Aizawa would then show up telling Izuku to follow him, as Izuku would, as Aizawa would then take him down to a training field, where they would then begin their training. This is where Aizawa would tell Izuku that he is just going to be teaching Izuku the basics of hero training, which is what all of the students had learned. Izuku hadn't missed much, so he didn't really have much to be caught up on. Basically, the first month of UA was just everyone getting used to high school, and basically free assignments that everyone knew, just to recap their minds on what they had learned before the school they went there. So Izuku would have not had to do any of this, and he would just have to do some of the assignments that the other kids had already done. And he didn't have to do all of them, only some of them, as Nezu thought it would just be putting too much stress on someone who would go from nothing to a ton of work to do. So that's what Izuku's schedule would be. Just training in the morning, work in the afternoon. And that's how it would go for a month. And Izuku would get quite a bit stronger than this. And if you're wondering how Aizawa's quirk could work on Izuku's quirk, it couldn't work at all. Remember, Izuku's quirk cannot be stolen, hidden, it can't be erased or anything like that. So, after the month had passed, Izuku would walk into the UA building not wearing any uniform. He hadn't been given one, and really they didn't suspect him of wearing one. This is a kid that would go from wearing whatever the hell he wanted for 5 years and would have to be put in a uniform because yeah, that makes sense. I mean, everyone had to, but Izuku hadn't been in school since the age of 4, so he really didn't care for a uniform, even though that's what they were basically told they have to wear from the ages early on at the beginning of their school age. So Izuku would just sit down, as Ida would then step up, yelling at Izuku for not wearing his uniform and asking why the heck he's in their building or classroom when shouldn't he be in another one, and he should also be punished for not wearing his uniform, of course, because that's just the UA standard. However, Aizawa would walk in right as Ida would start yelling at Izuku, telling Ida to shut up, as that Izuku didn't really have to wear a uniform. He wasn't supposed to either, as Nezu just wouldn't really care. As Nezu just didn't care what Izuku did that much, as long as he just didn't leave the UA building or campus, because Izuku couldn't leave the campus. He might have been a villain outside of it, and sure, Nezu didn't want something like that to get away from his hands, too, so Izuku would have to be forced to stay inside of the campus. If he were to get out, he'd be treated like a villain and would then go to jail, being expelled from UA. So, since that deal Izuku made with Nezu, he's just been forced to stay in the surrounding campus. Now, before the Sports Festival would begin, the students would be told that dorms had been built and they will now have a week off to put all of their luggage and everything like that into the building. Nezu had decided to delay the sports festival a week just so everyone can move into the dormitories and get satisfied with what they had. So the students would get another week off, which would be quite a while, especially for somebody who hadn't been practicing or learning at all, meaning they would get quite rusty and wouldn't be able to use their quirk to the fullest or power that they could have before this. However, Izuku had been training with Aizawa, and since he didn't have any belongings, he could just easily go right into the dormitory and just sit on the blank floor. Everyone was supposed to bring their own beds and all of that, but since Izuku didn't have any parents or any room to get a bed from, Izuku was just supplied with the basic essentials. He had a desk, a couple of pencils, and a bed. That is pretty much it. So Izuku would continue on with his schedule as Aizawa would continue teaching him. However, it would change. Izuku would have to get used to waking up very, very early to go along with Aizawa's schedule, since Izuku would now have to go into the school building for school. So they're going to have to wake up to train very early before this. So Izuku would do that as he would continue waking up and just training with Aizawa for the next week, as he would see many kids arrive with moving trucks that would have to be brought in by Nezu, who would also have an inspecting team to inspect, making sure no villains had gotten onto the trucks, where they would then be able to move all of their furniture and luggage into the room, which Momo, of course, would have a ton of it, not able to put anything anywhere, having no storage since they're only dorms, so she would have to throw many of her stuff away. Remember, she comes from a rich family and didn't really have the hardships Izuku would be going through, and she just had a ton of furniture that she had to deal with, and since she was now moving into dorms, her parents just forced her to take all of her just furniture out of her rooms. So Izuku would continue training, just seeing all of this furniture sitting outside, as Aizawa would decide to put this furniture to use, making Izuku lift the furniture while Aizawa was sitting on top of it, most likely taking a nap before the school day started. So Izuku would be doing this basically just getting tons of strength in his arms and legs, whether he was doing just leg push-ups with it or arm push-ups with it, it doesn't really matter. So when that week would pass, Izuku would be ready for the UA Sports Festival. So when all of them were told to go down to the drop-off area for their bus, as they would then pile onto their bus and would begin the 1-hour journey to the UA Sports Festival. They had gotten to school at 7 a.m. and the sports festival started at 12 p.m., so they had 5 hours to prepare themselves mentally and physically. However, Izuku would just be sitting there taking a nap, exhausted from the training he did before. So when he would wake up, they would have 30 minutes to get down to the drop-off bay and get onto the bus. So Izuku would hurry onto the bus, as he would then wait the remainder of the time until the bus would depart from the UA building. As an hour later, they would then arrive at the Sports Festival Coliseum, as Izuku would then get out to see everyone else walking into another building, which Aizawa was standing out front of. This was the locker rooms. It was connected to the Sports Festival, as it was just another area below the sports festival that had security all around it to make sure none of the civilians or family members got into the locker rooms. So when they would get into there, they would then be separated into boys and girls, as they would then get changed with a certain key that Aizawa had given them, which belonged to their locker, as they would then file into their respective locker room, being the Class 1A room, where they would then have to wait until the sports festival would begin. And when it did, Izuku and the rest of Class 1A would be forced to walk out. This is where Bakugo would make his speech, where he would say that he is going to easily win the sports festival, which Izuku, seeing Bakugo's arrogance, would give Izuku a newfound drive to surpass Bakugo in everything he could. Izuku never liked overly confident people, as he never wanted to become one of those either. He had a regeneration quirk, so he had every bit of right to be overconfident, since he could just regenerate any part of his body that he wanted to. So Izuku had the right to be confident, but he didn't want to become like Bakugo, someone so arrogant he was blinded by it and would just think everyone is a little pebble in their path or a little fly they can swat away with the back of their hand. So when Izuku would hear Bakugo's speech, he would decide there that he was going to humiliate Bakugo in the finals, and he was going to meet him there. So, as the first event would be announced to be a race, Izuku knew he was going to have trouble. He knew he wasn't going to get first, that was for sure, but he definitely wasn't going to get last either. He had been training for this moment and was quite fast, along with having a great amount of stamina. So when Izuku would then start to run, as the count would start, I'm fumbling with my words here, as the timer would start, as they all had 30 minutes to reach the end of the course, and Izuku, having already lined up with the rest of the people in this small hallway, as the doors would open, midnight yelling go, Izuku would immediately start to sprint off, pushing people past. He wasn't going to let his goal be outshined by others trying to surpass him. So Izuku would easily pass these people and would continue on going, as Izuku would finally reach the first obstacle, the 0-pointer. However, he would see they were already flat on their backs because of Todoroki and Bakugo passing them. So Izuku would continue on sprinting, not wanting to be too far behind, as he would make it to the second event, being just the Pit of Doom. He had to hop from rock to rock to make sure he didn't fall into it, and that's exactly what he would do, hopping from rock to rock, hoping he didn't fall down into the pit. And once he passed that, he would be met with the minefield. He would see Bakugo and Todoroki already past him, and that they were going to get either first or second. So he decided he was going to get third, and seeing Todoroki's ice path and looking how thick it was, Izuku decided that he could possibly run on it. And so Izuku would get somewhat of a run-up and would then start to slide on the ice, seeing how Todoroki was doing it and mimicking him. As Izuku would learn, he was a pretty good person who could mimic others' actions, as he would then cross the minefield and would get third place in the race, as Izuku would then look around to see Bakugo and Todoroki walking out into one of the big doors. There were the amount of doors, how many class 1s there were. So I think it's like class 1A, class 1B, then there's class 1C, class 1D. I believe that's because it's first year and then how high it is. So that's how many doors there would be, as Izuku would walk into the door with class 1A written above it, as that would be their waiting room, and they would be forced to wait the remainder of time they had until the race would finish and to where the next event will then be told and begin. Izuku would be waiting in the waiting room for the cavalry battle to begin. Of course, he didn't know it was the cavalry battle, as the first event, the racing event, he had just finished, and now would have to wait just around 10 to 15 minutes before it would end, as Izuku didn't have any place to look up at a TV which had the time and clock where he could see how much time was left. So Izuku was just forced to wait there with the two other people that had passed, being Todoroki and Bakugo. Bakugo would have gotten first and Todoroki second. Bakugo getting a newfound rage, saying, "How could this just half and half person beat me? He has 2 half-powered quirks while I have 1 full-powered quirk, and I should be able to beat him." And this clearly wasn't the case. Bakugo had no clue about any of Todoroki's quirks, besides knowing it was fire and ice. That is it. So Izuku would just be waiting there for 10 to 15 minutes, and after that, he would finally be able to do something, as he would be able to walk out of the waiting room, as he would then stand in a massive group. As Midnight would then step up to the podium and would start talking and explaining the second event. Izuku didn't have enough time to get in a group and have enough friends or know enough people to get a group for the cavalry battle. So when Midnight was explaining how it was going to be a team event, Izuku already knew he was going to be screwed. But thankfully, since he got third place, there were many people wanting to join his team simply because of the points he has. So Izuku would be sitting there waiting for something to happen, as Midnight would tell them they have now 5 minutes to make your teams, and after that, if you don't have a team, you're on your own for the rest of the event. Good luck, and now start. As the 5 minutes would then start counting down, as people would start to rush over to random people trying to get into their group. Of course, Bakugo, having the 10 million point headband, would only have 2 people go. Sorry about that cutoff, guys. Like I said, I'm using some random app off of the Google Play Store, and it legit just crashed on me, so sorry that it just cut off. As I was saying, Bakugo would only have 2 people come up to him to join his group, these being Kirishima and Kaminari. Kaminari going to Bakugo would also cause Mineta to end up wanting to join Bakugo's group as well. So Bakugo would now have a full team of people on his side, as Todoroki would then make a group, and that leaving Izuku out of the top 3 to not have a group. Now, Izuku would get a lot of people wanting to join his group. Them seeing that the second place winner had already been taken off and his team had now already been made, they would need to find another person in the top 5 or top 10 to make a group with, and one of those people being Izuku, who placed third. So one of the people that would end up joining his group was Uraraka, as Hatsume would also join his group, and also Tokiyami, this being the exact same team Izuku had in the sports festival in canon My Hero Academia. So when the cavalry battle would finally begin, they would just work on protecting the amount of points he had. Todoroki would end up having a 1,000 point headband, while Izuku would have a 500. They decided if they just looked at how much points each team had up on the leaderboard that would be constantly shifting and moving, and if they could stay in the top 4, that would be good enough. As they wanted to stay in top 5, but top 4 would be better, as they think they're not just going to have only 2 teams or 3 teams move on, they're going to have at least 4. And just to be safe, instead of being the 5th team, they'll be the 4th team. So that 500 points would really help, as they would just set off to try to dodge as many people as possible. Them being 3rd wouldn't get as much attention as either Bakugo or Todoroki. So Izuku got one of the best places he could have gotten. So Izuku would continue this being just dodging everyone who would go for them, which was a small group of teams, maybe around 3 out of the 10 to 12 some teams there were. I can't really remember how many teams there were just a lot of teams in Ken and My Hero Academia, and I don't think very many people know the exact number of teams that were there. So Izuku and his team would end up passing, as they would then be told they can go back into the waiting room, while those who are eliminated can now go into the stands to watch the rest of just the tournament. And now the third and final event will be the 1v1 tournament, and they will now take a 30-minute rest and lunch break until they can figure out who shall be in the bracket or not. By now, it had already been an hour and a half since the 12 p.m. start time. So it was around 1:30, and they were now being given lunch and all of that, as they just needed to take a break for the contestants that were going to be doing the tournament, and also just for the people in the stands who were now hungry and didn't want to eat while watching the tournament. So when this 30-minute break was up, and they finally began the 1v1 tournament, Izuku and his team would end up going against, or not his team, just Izuku would end up going against Shinso, just like in canon My Hero Academia. So Izuku would walk up onto just this tournament style arena. It's the exact same block as it was in the anime. So he would look over at Shinso, as Shinso would tell him that he's going to lose, as Izuku would not really say anything. Now, the reason of this is because while he was walking up, he would end up being stopped by Ojiro while in the waiting room, where Ojiro would say that he saw Izuku going up against Shinso. While Ojiro has never even met or talked to Izuku before, he wanted him to know not to answer any of Shinso's questions. He's just looking out for someone or a fellow student in Class 1A, even though they've never talked or even met before, because this is basically the first time Izuku has ever met any of the people in Class 1A. So Izuku would thank Ojiro and would then go out onto the block. Izuku, not taking any risks, would take Ojiro's word that Shinso had some type of mind control or mind-reading quirk. So he would decide not to talk rather than having a big mouth, something that Bakugo would probably have lost to if he was up against Shinso in the first round. So Izuku would wait for the match to begin, as Midnight would then yell begin, as Shinso would start trying to just insult Izuku, like insulting his classmates. However, something that Shinso did not know is that Izuku was not even in Class 1A for the past 2 months or past 3 months. He wasn't in Class 1A. He has no clue who these people he's insulting. The only person or person's name he knows in Class 1A is Ojiro. So he really doesn't know even what their quirks are. So something like Shinso, who's been watching them closely, just trying to spit out insults, he's insulting the wrong person because Izuku doesn't know any of the things he's insulting. So it goes completely ineffective, as Izuku would just have his mind blank. He has no clue what Shinso's even talking about. So deciding to end it quickly, which is something Aizawa taught him, is to always end the fight as quickly as possible. It's better to end it quickly rather than to draw it on for longer than it has to be and get more lives hurt or damaged in the process. So Izuku would rush in and would take out Shinso quickly by grabbing Shinso's neck and slamming him onto the ground in sort of type a chokehold thing, as Shinso would then not be able to continue, as he would look at Midnight, as if telling her through his eyes that he has lost and he cannot continue this. So she would end the match, as Izuku would then get up and start to walk back to the waiting room, while Shinso would have to walk back into the stands. He had gotten the farthest out of anybody in Class 1C. Nobody else from any classes below the hero course had even made it to the 1v1 tournament, just Shinso. So it was a massive feat for all of the lower level classes. So Izuku would watch through one of the TVs in the waiting room what was happening next, all of the different matches, as finally the first round would end up being over, as the second round would end up starting. Izuku, having had to take the first match of the first round, would get to take the last match of the second round, so he would have more time to rest, and someone who took the second match of the first round would also be put in the last round, or the last match of the second round. So Izuku sitting there waiting for something to happen, as he would see all of the different fights going on, who would end up going on to the semifinals, and who he wanted to verse in the semifinals. However, he saw that Bakugo was in a completely different bracket than he was, as Izuku would smile happily at this. Izuku knew since Bakugo was in a different bracket, he was going to be able to take on Bakugo in the finals if he won his next two fights. So his next fight would finally announce that it was going to be him versus Todoroki, as they would be forced to walk up onto the arena, as Todoroki would look at Izuku just completely confused. Todoroki had gotten to see what all of his classmates' quirks were, since he had been their classmate for over 2 months, and since that, he knew all of their weaknesses by just watching them and how they played out in the hero training that they did with All Might. So, when it came to his battle with Izuku, he had no clue what Izuku's quirk was. Izuku had not even used his quirk at all during the sports festival. His quirk is completely useless in the sports festival. It's a regeneration quirk. It's really only good for fighting villains. And so Izuku is much like Shinso. His quirk's not going to help him defeat robots. I mean, sure, it's going to help him if he punches metal and breaks his fists or knuckles, but sure, that's a little bit of help boosting him, but it's not going to help his athletic performance at all. So Izuku knew that his quirk wasn't the best for something like this, something like Bakugo or Todoroki's quirks. So Aizawa, also knowing this, would train Izuku extensively during that month how to use martial arts, how to use different sorts of weapons too. Since Izuku couldn't use weapons, he would rely on his martial arts that he had learned from Aizawa. And so the match would begin, as Todoroki would send a massive iceberg right at Izuku, as Izuku would jump out of the way, dodging it, as Izuku would be forced to come up with a game plan on what he should do against Todoroki. He had nothing or no plan at all for how his fight should play out against Todoroki. He had no clue what to do at all. So Izuku would be forced to start thinking about how he should play his cards, as Izuku would start to jump around, making it a lot harder for Todoroki to accurately predict where he should shoot his next iceberg to hopefully hit Izuku. So Izuku hopping around as fast as he could, as if he was just jumping around the arena, as he would all of a sudden immediately switch directions, making it impossible for Todoroki just to send a massive iceberg right in front of Izuku. As Izuku would jump sideways or diagonal, he would continue doing this jagged motion, making it harder for Todoroki to even predict his actions, as Todoroki would start to become dizzy, as he would continually send these icebergs out as they would go nowhere, as it was just making it easier for Izuku to dodge his attacks. By making walls around the arena, Izuku could jump off of the ice, breaking it and shattering it so that it wasn't an obstacle in the future, while also using it as something to get out of the way from something of one of Todoroki's attacks. So Izuku would all of a sudden appear next to Todoroki, who had already started suffering from frostbite, as Izuku would punch Todoroki's cheek right across the face, as Todoroki would slide, barely catching himself with an iceberg, as Todoroki would start to breathe very heavily. Todoroki had used his iceberg quirk to the point where he had started frostbite, and he would get very hurt if he continued what he was doing, and Izuku would see this. However, Izuku knew if he was going to move on to the semifinals and hopefully the finals, he was going to have to use this to his advantage. Izuku doesn't know Todoroki has a fire quirk, so he can never say, "Use your fire, Todoroki." Now, this would of course be yelled by Endeavor, but Izuku had blocked out the crowd entirely. All he could hear was midnight and just the announcers basically announcing everything that was happening. So Izuku would continue his strategy as Todoroki would continually just get more and more frostbite, and finally Todoroki would fall to his knees and would pass out from frostbite, as Izuku would wave to Midnight as if saying, "Bring like some type of ambulance or bring health down here, or first aid down here to help assist Todoroki." And all of a sudden a very short grandma type person would end up running out onto the field, as immediately two bigger guys would end up coming out holding a stretcher, placing Todoroki onto it, running out, as you can see Recovery Girl putting something into Todoroki's arm, hopefully trying to heal him, as Todoroki would be taken off to the first aid center. Izuku knew what he was doing, but it doesn't matter. This is a tournament, and if you're going to do that, you're doing that to yourself. It's not his fault you basically lost the tournament because of yourself. Izuku landed one punch, and that was it. That's all it took, as Todoroki would just continually try and do this, as the one punch caused Todoroki to become more desperate, sending more and more icebergs, which led to him getting frostbite faster and the match going by a lot faster. And finally, the semi-finals would begin, as Izuku would be put in the first round of the semi-finals, putting that right next to each other. And since he was going to be versing Ida, he had to try to conserve as much energy as possible. He had a 5-minute break, and he needed to just get as much rest as possible. So Izuku would sit down on the arena as it was getting cleaned up and just destroying all of the ice around it, as Izuku would be sitting there, thinking he doesn't have enough time to go to the waiting room and back, as that would just be a severe waste of energy. So he would just sit there, waiting for something to happen or waiting for the semifinals to begin. And this would actually work in favor for Izuku. Izuku would end up getting a lot of his energy back, and it finally came to versing Ida. Izuku would see the engines in Ida's leg, as Izuku would then realize that is a major just weak point for Ida. If Izuku trips Ida, which Izuku made the assumption Ida has some sort of speed quirk, if all Izuku has to do is trip up Ida's footing, and he falls down, that is an easy victory. But the problem is catching up and getting close enough to Ida to where you could trip him. So Izuku would be sitting there thinking of a game plan as the match would begin. Immediately, Izuku would punch the ground, hoping that it would break, and of course it wouldn't. but it would crack, as Izuku would continue smashing his fist into the pavement, as it would finally break open as Izuku was able to grab a rock, as he would then run to the center, as Ito, seeing his chance and opportunity, would start to run circles around Izuku, as if trapping him inside of his circle that he was running around. Izuku would start to calculate everything that Ito was doing, as Izuku would see how fast Ito was moving, as Izuku would hopefully just take a shot with the rock and throw it in the line of fire with his feet. And Izuku got severely lucky, as he would hit Ito's foot, causing him to look down, stumbling down as he would slam into the pavement, sliding against it, as Izuku would jump into action, grabbing Ito's neck, pinning him to the ground, as the match would end much like it had against Shinso. And finally, Izuku would be going against Bakugo. Here it was, the final match, Izuku versus Bakugo. This was it. As Izuku would be told that there is going to be a 15-minute break before then, as Izuku would just rather stand on the arena, and that's exactly what he did, as the crowd would see Izuku standing right on the arena waiting for Bakugo, as Bakugo would finally walk onto the arena after the 15 minutes had passed. Izuku, who had been waiting there for 15 minutes, now having plenty of energy. As the match would begin, Bakugo immediately jumping in, sending himself flying towards Izuku with explosions blasting off of his hands, as he would reach Izuku and would put his hand around Izuku's head, making a massive explosion. This surely would have killed any normal person, as the smoke would reveal Izuku's head half gone, as his left eye was completely missing, as his brain was clearly visible. The crowd would gasp in shock, as Izuku's brain would start to slosh out of his head, slamming itself against the ground. However, in moments, Izuku's head would reconstruct itself, just appearing right back to normal, and Izuku taking the shock factor that Bakugo had just witnessed into account, Izuku would take his fist and throw it right at Bakugo's face, punching it right between his eyes, shattering Bakugo's nose, as Bakugo would fall to the ground holding his nose, which he now had a bloody nose. Izuku had just broken it, as Bakugo would start to scramble back, sending out an explosion to hopefully make some distance against him and Izuku, as Izuku would then appear right next to Bakugo, as Izuku would then punch Bakugo's nose again, as Bakugo would scream out in pain. Izuku had broken it, and since that, he could use that to his advantage, as Bakugo would then jump up, starting to look around. He had made a massive cloud of smoke, and he had no clue where Izuku could be, as Izuku would then appear right behind Bakugo, putting Bakugo into a chokehold and knocking him out. Izuku had won so swiftly and easily, the entirety of Class 1A was in shock, as Aizawa would just smile, as Aizawa wasn't able to teach any of the students how he taught Izuku. He had restrictions on what he could teach the students. However, with Izuku, Nezu didn't tell him anything. Nezu basically said, go ahead, teach him whatever you wanted. All he has to do is be caught up in the hero and academics that they have already learned throughout the past 2 months. And so, Aizawa got through this in 1 week, with Izuku's very fast learning that Izuku has gotten, as this is basically the same Izuku as in canon. Izuku loves to learn. He has not been in school since the age of 4, which Izuku would end up loving to learn, as he would be able to easily go through all of the work Aizawa would give him in just a week. So this would give them 3 weeks to do all of the things Aizawa wanted to teach the students but couldn't, which involved deadly martial arts, which Izuku would end up using on Bakugo, allowing Bakugo to easily be defeated by Izuku. And after 30 minutes, the arena would be gone as the podium ceremony would finally take place. Izuku in first place, Bakugo in third place, and Tokiyami in third place. And that's how it would be, as Izuku would smile with his third place medal on his chest and around his neck, as Class 1A would finally realize who they just had in their class. Izuku jolts up out of his bed. He had just had a dream about his parents, a flashback. Izuku would hold his head as if he was thinking, I haven't remembered my parents in years. Guess I just buried it under all the memories I've gained, Izuku would say, as he would just want to find out who his parents were. I mean, he cannot remember anything about them. The only thing he remembers is that his last name was Midoriya, and that is knowledge he gained from his dream. And he's going to believe that dream, because Izuku really has nothing or nowhere else to go off of, so he'd rather believe his dream than believe that there is no last name that he has. So Izuku would walk down to the computer lab in the Class 1A dorm rooms, as Izuku would then find the computer lab, as he would then step into it. As he would turn on one of the computers and would start searching up the Midoriya name, as it would then pop up that 3 people that had the Midoriya name have been missing for around 11 years. Izuku Midoriya, that being him, Hisashi Midoriya, his father, and Inko Midoriya, that being his mother. As Izuku would start looking through this article that had been written as the year he went missing, talking about how this entire family had just gone missing, as Izuku would start to learn who his parents were, completely shocked that he had just not known who his parents were for so long. So he would start reading and just keeps going on and digging into what his parents could be and where they could be. Are they still alive or are they dead? So Izuku would then type into the tab the year he went missing and people missing in the year he went missing, as something would pop up, an article talking about 2 very famous heroes that had went missing. As Izuku would read on it, as he would then find out it's too much of a coincidence that these people just went missing the exact same day that his parents went missing. And so Izuku would connect the dots and make the connection that his parents were these heroes. But then why would they abandon him like that? As Izuku would continue reading, as he would then find out that the hero that his mother was, I don't want to create names for them, as the hero that his mother was ended up found dead in an alleyway in her hero costume, as Izuku would then just be shocked. So his mother was dead, but where could his father be? If his mother was dead, then his father must be dead too, right? As Izuku would then find out that the identities of Inko Midoriya was revealed as the hero. So everyone knows that Izuku's mom is this hero, but she's dead, and Izuku is still missing. As Izuku has the Izuku name, but that's just a first name. A ton of other people could have the Izuku name, but not a lot of people would have the Midoriya name. So when Nezu typed in Izuku to the system, he really couldn't find anything else that really matched with Izuku. Sure, there was Izuku Midoriya, but there really isn't much to go off of when Izuku says he doesn't have a last name. So as Izuku would continue reading, he would just be marveled at how much information this was just lying under his nose the entire time. As Izuku would then stumble upon something. The king of the underworld, all for one. As Izuku would continue reading on this, as it would then basically list the entire story about all for one. Izuku was now on the dark web. He was completely gone from the safer, normal traveling web where he can search anything up and be protected. All for one. Someone who's born around 40 years ago, and this person had a brother, and they were born with the quirk All for One and One for All, two very, very rare quirks, the only of their kind. As Izuku would see this, as he would then go to his father's page and would start reading on what he was born with. He was born with All for One, the quirk, as Izuku would then realize his father was the king of the underworld, the king of the villain world. As Izuku would then click on One for All and would see that his father had a brother, and this brother was known as Toshinori, and this would of course be All Might, someone who was in the battle against his brother All for One, or Hitachi, I don't know. I don't know how to pronounce it. So, this universe is completely different from canon My Hero Academia. Instead of All for One being hundreds of years old, and same with the quirk One for All, both of these people were born with it. Hitachi, I'll be saying. Hitachi born with All for One, and All Might born with One for All. There is no Nana Shimura, or any of those predecessors to that had One for All. One for All cannot be passed down at all. It is simply just a strength quirk that is severely powerful, while All for One is a quirk that can take quirks and give them to other people while also using it themselves. So Izuku would then read about all of this, how All Might's identity is already known on the black web, or the dark web, or deep web, or whatever you want to call it, while no one in the real world knows. It's like, how have they not realized any of this? So Izuku would decide to go to bed, waiting till the next morning to tell everyone this information. Well, not everyone, not his classmates, just his teachers, as he would then wake up at around 10 a.m. as it was already in the weekend, or it was Saturday. So Izuku would go over to Aizawa, who was just sitting on the couch supposed to be supervising them, as Izuku would ask if he could meet with Nezu, Yu, and All Might in sort of like a meeting room. So Aizawa would tell Izuku sure, and just to follow him. As they would arrive at the school campus, as they would then go into a meeting room, as Aizawa had already called up Nezu and All Might. As Izuku would then tell All Might all of this information he knows, and how he knows who his father is, as All Might would look on in shock. You are not his father, his brother. As All Might would say, wait, you know my brother, All for One? Yes, of course I do, Izuku would answer. That is because he is my father. He abandoned me when I was supposedly quirkless, even though I had a regeneration quirk. They just couldn't identify it. So All Might would just wonder how something like this could go under his nose, how his brother could have a child without him knowing. As All Might would then tell Izuku or ask him if he's a spy or not, which of course if Izuku was, he wouldn't have told him, but Izuku would tell All Might, this is just the limit, or that's how much information I know. I've just learned this a couple of hours ago when I was in the computer lab just researching who my parents were. It's crazy to think how my father is some crazy overlord of the villains. It's still coming all to me right now. I can't really believe it, since I'm in a hero school. As Izuku would then be put in an interrogation room, one that he hadn't been put in since when he was captured by UA. As he would then be interrogated, but they would release him just moments later, seeing as he really has no clue who his father was. As it was true, the stories he was telling was true about him being abandoned. So Izuku would walk back to the dorms as the teachers would be sitting there, wondering what they should do now. As they would say, well, we should probably just continue on with the internships and go from there. So Izuku and everyone would end up getting a list of where they should go for their internships, as Izuku would choose to go to All Might's agency, of course, as All Might had actually not All Might, man. I mean, he would choose to go with Aizawa. I'm really fumbling with this part. I'm still kind of remembering the white flames stuff, and I have to stop myself and all that. Izuku would go to Aizawa's agency, wanting to learn more with Aizawa. He loved how Aizawa would teach him and wanted to learn even more. So when Izuku would arrive at night at Aizawa's agency, they would immediately go out hunting for villains, as Izuku would follow Aizawa, learning how to jump rooftop to rooftop with extreme speed and precision, as they would find many different villains hiding out in alleyways and would easily stop them. They would continue this up until Friday, the last day of Izuku's internship, as a massive explosion would be seen from across the city they were in, as Aizawa would tell Izuku to follow him very closely behind him, as Izuku would do this, as he would then see Aizawa looking down at tons of Nomus just attacking civilians and burning down buildings, as Aizawa would then see a purple portal open up, as the League of Villains would then step out of this portal, along with many other Nomus. Aizawa would immediately duck down and tell Izuku to get down as well, as Aizawa, keep fumbling. Aizawa would ask for All Might, Nezu, and all of the teachers and heroes that can get there to get there as soon as possible. This is a very serious thing that is happening in the city. And of course, tons of police are already on their way with heroes and all of that, but it isn't going to be enough. There is tons, possibly hundreds of Nomus in here, as Aizawa would then look over to see a very Darth Vader-esque villain step out of the portal. This, of course, would be All For One, as All Might would then arrive and would immediately go for All For One, knowing that if he were to take out the most powerful villain there, everything else should be severely easy, completely not worrying about any of the civilians, as All Might knew if he were to worry about them now, possibly hundreds more could die just because he worried about them then and got attacked and thrown into hundreds of buildings because of him worrying about them then. He'd rather risk a couple of lives to save thousands rather than to save a couple and save a couple of lives and kill thousands. So All Might would jump in attacking All For One, as Izuku would see this. His uncle fighting his father. It was quite strange to him, as Izuku would just continue watching this, just marveling at how fast they were and how powerful they were. As Izuku would then look on to see all of the heroes show up, along with everyone who was interning with them, as they would all just put them on top of the building with Izuku and tell them to stay there, and if the building were to collapse, hop to another building. They must stay safe. They have no time to take them back to UA and be safe with a ton of guards there. So they would all jump in and start fighting these Nomus. This was a final battle, basically. All Might fighting All For One. Tons of villains out there fighting heroes along with tons of Nomus. However, they weren't very high-powered Nomus. They were very weak Nomus, nothing compared to the Nomu at the USJ. They were horrible compared to that Nomu. As Izuku would see all of them fighting, just wondering how it could have gotten to this point so quickly. Izuku knew that him and his classmates were going to have to join in the fight. It was inevitable. He just had to wait for the right time, as many more villains would pile out of these portals as more and more heroes would end up showing up. Many of them rescue heroes trying to rescue all of the civilians, as the city would then start to be evacuated, as Izuku would then see tons of people piling out of these buildings, being attacked by villains or either running to safety, as Izuku would then tell all of his classmates they have to help with the rescue and savior of many of these civilians, as they would jump down off of the building and would start fighting against these villains, protecting all of the civilians, allowing for a wall of defense for them to continue on running out of the city. as they would do this so that they could escape, as many of them would get injured or knocked out, but they had to keep up this wall in line of protection, as if not, they might have had hundreds of lives lost. They were willing to risk their own lives to save others, and that is the very reason they became heroes. As Izuku would continue on fighting with his classmates, but eventually only 3 of them were left: Bakugo, Todoroki, and Izuku, fighting to just save all of them, as finally the villains would end up ceasing to keep on fighting, many of them knocked out or retreating, as Izuku would look around to see tons of bodies laying everywhere, either knocked out or dead, as Izuku would see Bakugo and Todoroki helping a injured civilian who had fallen with a broken leg after being attacked by a villain, as Izuku would look on to see many of his teachers watching from the ground after being either taken out or just restrained by the villains, watching as All Might and All for One would continue their fight throughout the city, destroying it, as crumbling buildings would fall around them, creating just a mask of smoke and debris, as Izuku would just try to look on and to see what the fate of his family was. If they were to die, he was going to be the only member of their family left, as Izuku would then see All Might go for one final punch, yelling at United States punch or something cringy and corny like that, just hoping to give the power to destroy All for One, as this punch would land a direct hit with All for One's helmet and breathing mask, completely crumbling it and destroying it, as Izuku would then see the dust fade as All Might was on his knees with his hand in the air, as All for One was barely standing, wobbling around but was laughing. He knew he had won. All Might had already used all of his energy up, but so had he. But he had one final attack left in his arsenal. This is where I am going to tell you all that I am going to be doing a happy ending and a happier ending and a sad ending to this What If. I basically want to give you guys just a choice, or not really a choice. I mean, you can skip ahead to find the happier ending because I'm going to do the sad ending first, but I'm basically giving you guys 2 timelines that are going to have different outcomes, as I know a lot of you guys hate it when I have a what if end with a sadder ending, but a lot of you guys like it when they're happier endings, and some of you like it sad, some of you guys like it happy, so I'm just going to do both. So now here is the sad ending. All for One, laughing, would tell all of the heroes that they failed and that their precious city was gonna go and blow up into thousands of little pieces, and possibly Japan as well, as All for One would then continue laughing but would also expand rapidly, getting bigger and bigger while also getting lighter and lighter. It was as if he was about to explode. Izuku, realizing this, would jump into action because none of the other heroes could do anything about it because they were either dead, knocked out, or restrained by other villains who had already been killed or knocked out as well. As Izuku would jump into action, grabbing All for One, and would continue running in that direction, gaining forward momentum as All for One continued getting lighter would allow Izuku to run faster. As All for One would continue expanding, Izuku knew if he could get into water, he could lessen the explosion that All for One was going to make. And if that were to happen, he could save thousands or possibly even millions of lives. As Izuku, luckily, was on an ocean town. This was an ocean city right on the banks of the ocean. As Izuku would reach the beach, jumping down and then run on the sand, as Izuku would then make it into water, swimming as fast as he can, as his arms would then start to get tired along with his legs. But Izuku knew he must keep going. It was for the fate of the city, or even for the world, rather, as Izuku would go deeper and deeper and deeper, as he would finally make it to where he was far enough and where he couldn't go any longer, as Izuku would then speak to All for One. Sure, they were underwater, but All For One had a quirk where he could understand what Izuku was thinking. As Izuku would tell All For One that it's not his fault he ended up this way, it's his quirk. Izuku had done a lot of research on All For One, and he found out that the quirk was researched by the quirk doctor that found out what the quirk was, and he found out that the quirk is an extremely villainous quirk that twists and changes the mind of the user into thinking that villainy is the only way of survival. As Izuku would then smile, telling his father that he forgives him, he did not know what he was doing back when he was a lot younger. And he also had so much more time to be twisted by this as he would continue getting more villainous and more villainous, but this was just the start. As Izuku would forgive him for what he had done, all that he had done, it's because of his quirk. He couldn't control it. As All For One would then explode, killing Izuku instantly, as the only way Izuku could be killed was having all of his blood and bones being vaporized by a massive explosion. So, since nothing was left, Izuku would end up dying, as All For One as well, as the ocean would then explode, as a massive wave would form, crashing into the beach, flooding it. But there was a flood wall there, since it is in Japan, as frequent earthquakes can cause floods and tsunamis. So it was able to stop there with some water flooding into the town, but it didn't kill anyone nor injure anyone. It was just a small price to pay for property damage to save millions of lives. As Izuku would then be remembered for his sacrifice, he may not have helped with the fight against All For One, but he did end it, and he was successful in it. It just cost him his own life, as Izuku would be remembered as a hero, and that is where the sad ending ends. I hope you all enjoyed it, and now the happier ending. All For One, now laughing, would tell all of the heroes how they failed and that he was going to destroy the city along with Japan. In one final act of villainy, he knew he wasn't going to survive, so he'd rather commit one final act of villainy, possibly killing thousands of people, than just to go out and die quietly. Izuku, immediately springing into action, would see All For One expanding rapidly, as Izuku would use his knowledge that he had gained that All For One was possibly going to explode, and so Izuku would start running towards the beach as he would try to grab All For One, in which he was successful. However, before he were to grab All For One, he would pull out a small, sharp knife, cutting off of his pinky, as it would then fall down to the ground, as Izuku would toss it to Bakugo, telling Bakugo to keep it in a safe place, as Izuku would then run over to All For One, now missing one of his pinkies, grabbing All For One, and would start to run over to the beach, as he would then jump down into the water along with All For One, burying All For One into the floor, or the beach bed, as All For One would then explode, completely vaporizing any signs of ocean life in a complete mile radius, as a massive crater would be left there. However, the impact would be severely weakened. However, Izuku being right at the epicenter of the blast, Izuku would have completely been vaporized, nothing left of him. However, Izuku would then slowly begin growing back from his pinky, starting with his hand, then his arm, and then shoulder, as his head would then start to form as well. However, Izuku had never regenerated his entire body before, so this would take around 24 to 48 hours for Izuku to do, as this would be heavily monitored, as Izuku would then finally grow back after around 36 hours and would retain all of his memories, as the heroes there, along with his classmates, would thank Izuku for his sacrifice at what he did, risking his life to save the city and possibly millions of other lives if the blast was as big as All For One was suggesting it was, as Izuku would then continue on his journey to becoming the #1 hero, as he would continue learning at UA, as he would then graduate and would then become a hero, eventually climbing the ranks and becoming the #1 hero. As that is where the happy ending ends, and this story ends too. I thank you all for watching What If Deku Had Regeneration. It was very fun to make, and I thank you all for watching it. I thank you all for watching this part and the series once again, and goodbye.